Walk Two Moons, Chapter 28. The Black Hills. When we saw the first sign for the Black Hills, the whispers changed and once again commanded, "Rush, hurry, rush." We had spent too long in South Dakota. There were only 2 days left and a long way to go. "Maybe we should skip the Black Hills," I said. "What?" Gramps said. "Skip the Black Hills? Skip Mount Rushmore? We can't do that." "But today's the 18th. It's the 5th day." "So we have a deadline someone didn't tell me about?" Gramps asked. "Heck, we've got all the time in the—" Gram gave him a look. "I've just got to see these Black Hills," Gramps said. "We'll be quick about it, Chickabiddy." The whispers walloped me. Rush, rush, rush. I knew we wouldn't make it to Idaho in time. I thought about sneaking off while Gram and Gramps were looking at the Black Hills. Maybe I could hitch a ride with someone who drove faster. But the thought of someone speeding, careening around curves, especially the snaking curves down into Lewiston, Idaho, which I had heard so much about, when I thought about that, it made me dizzy and sick. "Heck," Gramps said. "I ought to turn this wheel over to you, Chickabiddy. All this driving is making me as crazy as a loon." He was only joking, but he knew I could drive. He had taught me to drive his old pickup truck when I was 11. We used to ride around on the dirt roads on their farm. I drove, and he smoked his pipe and told stories. He said, "You're a hell of a driver, Chickabiddy, but don't you tell your mama I taught you. She'll thrash me half to death." I used to love to drive that old green pickup truck. I dreamed about turning 16 and getting my license. But then when Mama left, something happened to me. I became afraid of things I had never been afraid of before, and driving was one of these things. I didn't even like to ride in cars, let alone drive the truck. The Black Hills were not really black. Pines covered the hills, and maybe at dusk they looked black. But when we saw them at midday, they were dark green. It was an eerie green. All those rolling dark hills. A cool wind blew down through the pines, and the trees swished secrets among them. My mother had always wanted to see the Black Hills. It was one of the sights that she was most looking forward to on her trip. She used to tell me about the Black Hills, which were sacred to the Sioux Indians. It was their holy land, but white settlers took it as their own. The Sioux are still fighting for their land. I half expected a Sioux to stop our car from entering, and the thing is, I would have been on his side. I would have said, "Take it. It's yours." We drove through the Black Hills to Mount Rushmore. At first we didn't think we were on the right place, but then, jing bang, it was right before us. There, high up on the cliff face, were the 60-foot tall faces of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt, carved right into the rock, staring somberly down at us. It was fine seeing the presidents. I've got nothing against the presidents, but you think the Sioux would be mighty sad to have those white faces carved into their sacred hill. I bet my mother was upset. I wondered why whoever carved them couldn't have put a couple of Indians up there too. Gram and Gramps seemed disappointed as well. Gram didn't even want to get out of the car, so we didn't stay long. Gramps said, "I've had enough of South Dakota. How about you, Chickabiddy? How about you, Gooseberry? Let's get a move on." By late afternoon, we were well into Wyoming, and I added up the miles left to go. Maybe we could make it. Just maybe. Then Gramps said, "I hope nobody minds if we stop at Yellowstone. It would be a sin to miss Yellowstone." Gram said, "Is that where Old Faithful is? Oh, I would love to see Old Faithful." She looked back at me. "We'll hurry. Why, I bet we'll be in Idaho by the 20th without any problem at all." Chapter 29. The Tide Rises. "Did Peebee's mother call?" Gram said. "Did she come home? Did Peebee phone the police? Oh, I hope it isn't a sad story." Phoebe did go to the police. It was on the day that Mr. Berkoway read us the poem about the tide and the traveler, a poem that upset her, both me and Phoebe, and I think it's what convinced her, finally, that she had to tell the police about her mother. Mr. Berkoway read the poem by Longfellow. The tide rises, the tide falls. The way Mr. Berkoway reads this poem, you could hear the tide rising and falling, rising and falling. In the poem, a traveler is hurrying toward a town, and it is getting darker and darker, and the sea calls to the traveler. The Then the waves, with their soft white hands, wash out the traveler's footprints. The next morning, the day returns, but nevermore returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises and the tide falls. Mr. Berkway asked for a reaction to this poem. Megan said that it sounded soft and gentle, and it almost made her go to sleep. Gentle, I said. It's terrifying. My voice was shaking. Someone is walking along the beach, and the night is getting black, and the person keeps looking behind him to see if someone is following, and jing bang, waves come up and pulls him into the sea. A murder, Phoebe said. I went barreling on as if it was my poem and was expert. The waves with their soft white hands grab the traveler. They drown him. They kill him. He's gone. Ben said, maybe he didn't drown. Maybe he just died like normal people die. I said, it isn't normal to die. It isn't normal. It's terrible. Megan said, what about heaven? What about God? Mary Lou said, God? Is he in this poem? Ben said, maybe dying could be normal and terrible. And then the bell rang. I raced out of the room. Phoebe grabbed me. Come on, she said. From her locker, she took the evidence she had brought from home, and we both ran the 6 blocks to the police station. I'm not exactly sure why I went along with Phoebe. Maybe it was because of that poem about the traveler, or maybe it was because I had begun to believe in the lunatic, or maybe it was because Phoebe was taking some action, and I admired her for it. I wish I had taken some action when my mother left. I was not sure what I could have done, but I wish I had done something. Phoebe and I stood for 5 minutes outside the police station, trying to make our hearts slow down, and then we went inside and stood at the counter. On the other side of it, a thin man with big ears was writing in a big black book. Excuse me, Phoebe said. I'll be right with you, he said. This is absolutely urgent. I need to speak to someone about a murder, Phoebe said. He looked up quickly. A murder? Yes, Phoebe said, or possibly a kidnapping, but the kidnapping might turn into a murder. Is this a joke? No, it's not a joke, Phoebe said. Just a minute. He whispered to a plump woman in a dark blue uniform. She wore glasses with thick lenses. Is this something you girls have read about in a book? She asked. No, it is not, I said. That was the turning point, I think, when I came to Phoebe's defense. I didn't like the way the woman was looking at us, as if we were two fools. I wanted that woman to understand why Phoebe was so upset, and I wanted her to believe Phoebe. May I ask who it is that has been kidnapped or possibly murdered? The woman asked. Phoebe said, my mother. Oh, your mother. Come along, then. Her voice was sugary and sweet, as if she was speaking to a tiny child. We followed her to a room with glass partitions. An enormous man with a large head and neck and massive shoulders sat behind the desk. His hair was bright red and his face was covered in freckles. He did not smile when we entered. After the woman repeated what we had told her, he stared at us for a long time. His name was Sergeant Bickle, and Phoebe told him everything. She explained about her mother disappearing and the note from Mrs. Cadaver and Mrs. Cadaver's missing husband and the rhododendron, and finally about the lunatic and the mysterious messages. At this point, Sergeant Bickle said, what sort of messages? Phoebe was prepared. She pulled them out of her book bag and laid them on the desk in the order in which they had arrived. He read each one aloud. Don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins. Everyone has his own agenda. In the course of a lifetime, what does it matter? You can't keep the birds of sadness from flying overhead, but you can keep them from nesting in your hair. Sergeant Bickle looked up at the woman seated next to us, and the corner of his mouth were twitching slightly. To Phoebe he said, and how do you think these are related to your mother's disappearance? I don't know, she said. That's what I want you to find out. Sergeant Bickle asked Phoebe to spell Miss Cadaver's name. It means corpse, Phoebe said. Dead body. I know. Is there anything else? Phoebe pulled out the envelope with the unidentified hair strands. Perhaps you could have these analyzed, she suggested. Sergeant Bickle looked at the woman, and again the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. The woman removed her glasses and wiped the lenses. They were not taking us seriously, and I felt my ornery donkey self waking up. I mentioned the potential blood spots that Phoebe had marked with adhesive tape. But my father removed the tape, Phoebe said. Sergeant Bickle said, I wonder if you would excuse me a few minutes. He asked the woman to stay with him, and he left the room. With us, and he left the room. The woman asked Phoebe about school and about her family. She had an awful lot of questions. I kept wondering where Sergeant Bickle had gone and when he was coming back. He was gone for over an hour. There were 3 framed pictures on Sergeant Bickle's desk, and I tried to lean forward to see them, but I couldn't. I was afraid the woman would think I was nosy. Sergeant Bickle finally returned. Behind him was Phoebe's father. Phoebe looked extensively relieved, but I knew it was not a coincidence that her father was there. Miss Winterbottom, Sergeant Bickle said, your father is going to take you and your friend home now. But, Phoebe said, Mr. Winterbottom will be in touch, and if you would like me to speak with Mrs. Cadaver... Oh, no, Mr. Winterbottom said. He looked embarrassed. Really, that won't be necessary. I do apologize. We followed Mr. Winterbottom outside. In the car, he said nothing. I thought he might drop me off at my house, but he didn't. When he got to their house, the only thing he said was, Phoebe, I'm going to talk with Mrs. Cadaver. You and Sal wait here. Mrs. Cadaver was unable to give him any more information about Phoebe's mother's call. All Mrs. Winterbottom had said was that she would phone soon. That's all? Phoebe asked. Your mother has also asked Mrs. Cadaver how you and Prudence were. Mrs. Cadaver told her that you and Prudence were fine. Well, I am not fine, Phoebe said. And what does Mrs. Cadaver know anyway? And besides, Mrs. Cadaver is making the whole thing up. You should let the police talk to her. You should ask her about the rhododendron. You should find out who this lunatic is. Mrs. Cadaver probably hired him. You should... Phoebe, your imagination is running away with you. It is not. Mom loves me, and she would not leave me without any explanation. And then her father began to cry.